This is a very familiar story. Even people who know nothing about Jesus, the Bible, or Christianity are familiar with the Good Samaritan. One of our board members works at a hospital that bears that name. As with all things familiar, as we hear them over and over, they may start to lose their meaning. We may hear the beginning of the story and think, oh, I know this one, and tune out of it. But I'd like us to reconsider this parable and its meaning in Jesus' time and for us today. Will you pray with me? Loving God, may we all find nourishment in your word proclaimed today in this place. Amen. Have you noticed how much our society is polarized right now? Us, them, right, wrong, righteous, unrighteous, right, left, good, bad. It seems like it's everywhere. Of course you have. You are a sentient being in 2022. You've noticed the polarization. But I've been having to ask myself some very hard questions about this lately. Like, how's it serving us? How's it serving us to see one another as enemies with no capacity for redemption or humanity? How's it serving me to write off entire groups of people because I think I know how they feel about me in my life? How is it serving our communities to believe that there are those who are less than human or less deserving of God's love? You've heard me preach from this pulpit about how those darn Episcopal monks led me to pray for the well-being of people who do not have our well-being at heart. And not to pray just for a change of heart for those enemies, but for their joy and their happiness. Friends, this is some of the hardest work of the gospel, at least for me. But our parable today invites us once again into that hard gospel work. Some background, which I attribute to reading Amy Jill Levine, a Jewish New Testament scholar's work on the parables of Jesus. First of all, we need to understand what the relationship of Jews and Samaritans was in Jesus' time. And it may not be what you've heard, or even what I have preached before. The parable talks about the reactions of a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan to the plight of a person lying in a ditch. Here's the thing. The Jews of Jesus' time and Luke's time were very familiar with the priest that began with a priest and a Levite. It's like if I said to you, lions and tigers and bears. There you go. Right, bears. So for the people of Jesus in Luke's time, it would have been a priest, a Levite, and an Israelite. That was always the third. It would have been totally unpredictable for the parable to be about, totally predictable, for the parable to be about those three kinds of people. But Jesus did what Jesus almost always does in parables. He messed them up a little bit. Instead of lions and tigers and bears, it was more like lions and tigers and terrorists. Jews and Samaritans came from the same belief system. Over many years and many different kinds of conflicts, they became enemies. But they were enemies who were basically on equal footing. It wasn't like there was an oppressor and an oppressed. These were just two groups of people who did not like each other at all. And they had long history about that. Jews worshipped in Jerusalem. Samaritans had their temple in Gerizim. They both followed the Torah, albeit with different interpretations. And like many folks whose beliefs come from the same place but end up in very different expressions, they viewed each other as mortal enemies. It's entirely possible that upon hearing the word Samaritan, about the person who was going to help the person in the ditch, instead of the word Israelite, there were those among Jesus's and Luke's audience who thought to themselves, I'd be better off dead than rescued by a Samaritan. Kind of like we might think, I'd be better off dead than rescued by a murderer. But here's the thing. The priest and the Levite passed by. The ones who were taught by Jewish law that they must help the stranger, that saving a human life is more important than anything else, they passed by. And we don't know why. But Amy Jill Levine gives us a good idea about it. She quotes Dr. Martin Luther King in her book, Short Stories by Jesus. Here's what he said in a sermon. Well, here's what she says. The best explanation I've heard for the refusal of the priest and the Levite to come to the aid of the man in the ditch comes from Martin Luther King Jr., who preached. I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible these men were afraid. And so the first question that the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this person, what will happen to them? King went on, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? King then went to Memphis, and it was there that he was assassinated, because there are robbers on the road. There are robbers on the road, and we are afraid. As a young girl, a young woman, my father instilled in me a deep fear and distrust of folks, especially men, especially black men, who might ask me for money on the streets or any other kind of help. As I grew up and began to experience the world on my own, I came to understand that folks asking for money generally are not violent people. My wife, April, taught me how to interact with folks who were in need on the streets when we were in seminary together. I then worked with those folks at a soup kitchen and at a supportive housing facility. I heard their stories and I said hi to them on the streets outside of work hours. And yet still, when I am approached by someone I don't know, who looks very different from me, often my first response is fear. Often my first question is, what will happen to me, rather than what will happen to this person if I don't help? This fear shows up in so many ways in our lives, doesn't it? In my previous job, I was often very afraid of standing up to do keynote talks to my very educated peers and colleagues. My fear was, what will people say? What will they think of me? Anybody out there recognize that fear? Maybe just me. When I was a teacher, I dreaded the days that administrators would come into my classroom to evaluate me. What if they think I'm doing a bad job? What if I lose my job? 15, 20 years into my teaching career, those fears were pretty much unfounded, but there they were nonetheless. And I bet we've all been through fears like this. What if I lose my job? What if this beloved friend or family member dies? What if I have cancer? What if I get COVID? What if I can't afford to pay my bills? What if everything changes and I can't figure out what's next and it never goes back to the way it used to be? Maybe that's my fear as we continue to navigate this pandemic, because everything is changing and we have no idea what's next. But somehow that Samaritan, who had been taught the same things as his priest and his Levite counterparts, he got beyond that fear and he did what was right. He used his resources to help a person who needed it. He broke that cycle of violence between the Jews and the Samaritans. His actions actually harken back to a story in the Hebrew Scriptures. This is again from Amy Jill Levine's work. According to 2 Chronicles 2:28, 8 through 15, the Samaritans, here identified as the people of Israel, captured 200,000 Judean women, sons, and daughters. They also took much booty to Samaria. A prophet named Oded then condemned the Samaritan army. He said, because the Lord, the God of your ancestors, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand, but you have killed them in a rage that has reached up to heaven. Now you intend to subjugate the people of Judah and Jerusalem as your slaves. But what have you except sins against the Lord your God? Now hear me and send back the captives whom you have taken from your kindred, for the fierce wrath of the Lord is upon you. A number of the Samaritan leaders, chastened, agreed with the prophet, and their actions anticipate the imagery found in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Then those who were mentioned by name got up and took the captives. With the booty they clothed all that were naked among them. They clothed them, they gave them sandals, they provided them with food and drink, they anointed them, and carrying all the people among them on donkeys, they brought them to their kindred in Jericho, the city of palm trees. And then they returned to Samaria. The cycle of violence can be broken, my friends. What's difficult is that we may not like who is breaking it. We may not be ready to accept that our life could depend on someone whom we view as a true enemy. Someone who we are sure wants nothing for us but harm and damage. Last Friday, the opening keynote address of MCC's Global General Conference was given by one of my former seminary professors, Dr. Kwok Kwilan. Dr. Kwok talked about the queer spirit that we need right now. And one of the characteristics of queer spirituality that she talked about is communal spirituality. She talked about the moment of Pentecost and how they were together in one place. And they were people of different cultures and different tongues. She reminded us that the queer spirit did not descend on just one person. That people began to speak in other tongues not their own. That they were breaking boundaries imposed by culture and religion and languages. She asked us how we might speak in other tongues and how we might get out of our comfort zone to see the world through different eyes. She continued. She said, sometimes we think we are on the right side. We are the righteous ones. And she added quickly that she didn't mean that we have to compromise our truths or bend over backwards. But she said, can you entertain the thought that truth may be heard and encountered in more than one way, and it may not always be your way? Can the Spirit empower you to speak other tongues? And can she empower others to speak in other tongues as well? Whew. That is a big question. What would it mean for us at MCCPB, for our community, for the U.S., for the world, if we could acknowledge that the cycle of violence can be broken, that we may not always be right, and I'm preaching to myself here, that multiple truths can be present at once? I had a clergy friend once tell me that the problem he had with his associate pastor was that he didn't think she could truly fall in love with the congregation, and he didn't know how to help her with that. And that's what it all goes back to, doesn't it? The greatest commandment, to love God with all that we have and to love our neighbor, all of them, as ourselves. As we continue to move through these difficult times, can we find ways to love, fall in love maybe even, with people who see things differently than we do? It's something I know that I will be working on, and I hope you'll join me, because we can break the cycle of violence. Amen. Amen. Please join us for our hymn of response, I Want to Walk as a Child of the Light.